The stressors and experiences of military life far too often result in veterans having to deal with life-altering conditions and challenges that make life difficult for them as well as their loved ones. Today, we want to talk a bit about these issues and what can be done to help. Joining us from Nashville, Tennessee is Dr. Greg Wark. He is a U.S. federal law enforcement chaplain and has counseled members of the military and veterans for over 27 years. He is the co-author of The Warfighter's Soul, Engaging in the Battle for the Warrior's Soul. Greg, welcome to Bridge City News.
Good to be with you, Naveen. Thanks for having me.
Greg, can you just tell us, why did you write this book and what was the motivation?
Well, years ago, I kind of stumbled into working in a mentoring relationship with special operations here in the United States. That, by the way, has extended to both Canada and many of the other places as well. And so as I began to work with these individuals, very unique individuals, most people in normal society don't understand what actually is involved in giving your life, volunteering to give your life for the service of a country, for its freedoms. And, it's really true. Freedom isn't free. These individuals go to great extents to make sure that we can go to the grocery store, that we can do the things that we do as citizens, that we can have the pleasures that we do, that we can have our pools and so on and so forth. They go into the middle of hell and they fight fights that they didn't start. Unfortunately, the cost to them and their families is sometimes greater than it should be.
And when you're talking with individuals, do you find that that a lot of them who had just joined the military didn't know the distinction between a job and doing a service?
No, I think they do. They don't really have a choice because as they go through the process of boot camp and things of that nature, they're awakened pretty quick to the fact that, man, I did get into something. And this is not going to be easy. But you asked why I wrote the book. One of the things that really began to bother me a great deal as just a citizen who enjoys the things that they provide, and that is that the suicide rate was skyrocketing. And that's both the case in Canada. Presently in Canada, 10 people a day commit suicide.
Wow.
And in America, it's the same. And so what we're seeing, but among our veteran community, it's massively higher. And so I decided, okay, I see the problem. What am I going to do? Just acknowledge that there's a problem? That's pretty much what most people do. They just go, wow, that's really bad. I hate that statistic. But I'm the kind of individual that says, all right, I see the problem. Let me see if I can do something about it. So I began to work with veterans who were suicidal. Just in the last 2 days, I've worked with 2 suicidal veterans and helped them move beyond that. But what I decided is I'm going to come up with answers that are based upon real things that I know personally work. And I can put them in a book, and then they can be dispersed all over the world. And the individuals that read the book can either be helped by what they are, or they can help others they know by the treatments, and so on. So that's why I wrote the book.
And you're talking about like how the suicide rate for veterans is skyrocketing. What are some of the reasons behind the decisions to take one's own life?
Well, that's a really good question. The reasons are not that complicated, but the reason veterans commit suicide is, number one, that they have experienced combat trauma. That's written about extensively in the book, but they experience combat trauma. And what happens when they experience combat trauma, as long as they're in the community of others who have had the same experiences or something like those experiences, they're going to be okay. They don't commit suicide while they're in it. They commit suicide after they get out of that community, where they lose a sense of meaning. And then they suddenly realize that I'm no longer this individual that is clearly needed, that is clearly gifted, that has this ability that nobody else has. They get out into the civilian world, and unfortunately, they become a liability. And unfortunately, that because they are used to being a warfighter, being able to pull out a weapon and end their own life is probably not far from difficult.
So you're talking about combat-related trauma. For those that are struggling with it, you write that they don't think of themselves rationally. What are some symptoms of suicidal tendencies in warfighters, and how should we respond if we notice this?
Well, I have a whole chapter called Signs and Syndromes where I give the reader uh, things to look for to help them see if a person is headed towards that. It's kind of like they're spiraling down the drain, and that is a really kind of a complex chapter. It's something that's really worth reading. But one of the ways that I describe it is no matter who's watching right now, no matter whether it's a warfighter or whether it's a citizen, whether it's a mother, doesn't matter. Trauma is always the same to everybody. So let's say a molestation happened to someone when they were young. Trauma is kind of like this. Trauma is like a hand in front of your face. So essentially, it becomes you begin to look at all life through the trauma. You don't look at life freely. You look at life through the trauma. So the trauma tends to define life. And the only way to deal with that issue is to restructure trauma to a memory. So we have found a way to eliminate this so that people are able to see clearly life, not looking at life through their experiences, their difficult experiences.
Now, you've been a chaplain, so tell us, how much of a role does faith play when helping veterans overcome PTSD and other challenges?
Well, I can say that my faith has a great deal to do with in everything I put in the book. But one of the things I do not do is I do not approach a person with a traumatic event in their life, whether it be a warfighter or otherwise, with faith as the thing that I'm pushing first. Faith is something that I believe an individual who, once they have experienced a healing experience, once they've gone through that and they see that I can live again, that there's a reason for me to be here, that I have hope again. Once they acknowledge that there's hope again, they often move toward faith. And so it's kind of it's an evolutionary byproduct of them suddenly having hope again.
Now, you've experienced trauma yourself. Your son Adam died of a drug overdose a few years ago at the age of 37. You found yourself dealing with depression, guilt, and isolation. And you say that trauma creates duplicity in a survivor's life. What do you mean by that?
Well, it's kind of you live the life you have to live due to the trauma, and then you live the fake life to try to keep everyone else from seeing what you're going through. You use the example of my son dying. Right after Adam died, I didn't even realize that I was suffering from what had happened. And what I did is I put on that duplicity. I put on the other life. I'm okay. And this is typical with a lot of veterans. I'm okay. No, don't worry about me. I've got this. I'm going to be here for all you. I'm going to help everybody get through their issues. But you don't. But you're suffering inside as well, and that really becomes a problem because you cannot live two lives successfully. Ultimately, you'll tank both of them.
And can you tell us, why do so many soldiers have a difficult time to integrate back into regular civilian life after leaving the military? What kinds of problems do they typically run into?
Well, they come from a very structured, their life is a byproduct of orders. Their life is a byproduct of leadership. They come from a life that um, really it's a world in and of itself. Then they are suddenly introduced, regardless of the way they were introduced to it, they're introduced to a society that is kind of uh, I don't really know if I need to say, but society's a little crazy, and things don't function in a normal, quote, normal manner. And oftentimes they can't get a job that fits their skill sets because their skill sets don't coincide with skill sets that are needed in society. So there needs to be a great deal of work to reintegrate our military personnel into something that they feel is meaningful.
And I guess it can be really easy to forget what the civilian life is like. I remember even like as a Sea Cadet going to cadet camp for 8 weeks and coming back and not having that structure in my life, and that was only for 8 weeks. So I imagine, like reintegrating after years in the military can be quite an uphill battle.
Oh, it is. And if and I think one of the important things, it's not just difficult for the military person, it's still difficult for the family, because I don't know if you've seen, there's movies out where you see a guy who's a bomb tech. He comes back and his wife takes him to the grocery store. She tells him to go get cereal, and you see this bomb tech who's used to life and death on a daily basis, and he cannot figure out which cereal to pick. That's how foreign normal, quote, normal life is to them. So families really need to work hard to help, and society, by the way, as well, to help the veteran, to understand, first of all, what they're going through, and to help that individual feel a sense of meaning and welcomeness. At present, we tend to, as a society, treat veterans with mild neglect at best, because we just don't get them. They're stoic, they're blunt. Sometimes they look at you different. In fact, that's one of the things I write about in the book, is that warfighters, when they've gone through war, their eyes change. The way they look at life change. The way they look at people changes. There's something about being in combat and doing what people do in combat that forever changes people. Now, I've worked with special operations individuals for most of my adult life, and I've noticed that change. So I work with them while they're in training, and then I work with them when they come back. And the change in them is really easily recognizable.
Wow. And why is it important to understand conflict in relationship to suicide? How can a warfighter resolve feelings of internal conflict or betrayal from leadership?
Well, first they have to own their own trauma. I think we can't get away from that. That they have to admit to themselves that they do have a problem, and that problem is not just it's not just them being weak, or it's not just them being a wuss or something like that. They need to look at that, literally write down the traumatic event, write down their issue, and confront that issue with the support of others or someone that can give them help.
And how effective is counseling for those veterans struggling with mental health issues? And what would you say to someone who is thinking, should I go for help, or maybe I'll be fine on my own?
Well, I can tell them without a doubt, you're not going to be fine on your own. It's just not going to happen. I have a friend who came back from Vietnam, and he came back so messed up that he decided that he'd just get on his horse and take off. No one saw him for 6 months. And while he was in the woods living off the land, he came close to suicide. He said something like 60 times. And it was only when he came out and began to reach out for help that he was able to get it and become a very successful businessman. I can say, you don't have to be alone. If you're a veteran, you're watching this right now, you don't have to be alone. There's nothing wrong. There's nothing weak about asking for help. There's nothing about it. It's just you need to ask the right people. If you have people in your life that are bumbling idiots, or they don't know how to live their own life, you don't want to talk to them. You want to talk to somebody who will help direct and guide you towards someone who can help you debrief and deal with the issue that is causing your suffering.
Well, we're out of time, but thank you so much for being with us today, Greg.
My pleasure. You have a wonderful rest of the day.
Dr. Greg Wark is the co-author of The Warfighter's Soul: Engaging Battle for the Warrior Soul.